Where are all the elk in Colorado, especially in September when you're trying to find them? The answer seems simple, but remember, simple doesn't necessarily mean easy. Simply put, they are where you are not. Everything I'm about to say are generalities. It's important to remember that elk do not read the textbook or follow our instructions. There will always be outliers to the things I'm about to say among elk. Talking about where they are overall in the month of September. In early September, most big bulls will be at or above timberline. During the third to final week of September, the bulls will come down to where the cows are, about 3/4 slope. There's much better food for the bulls while they're growing their antlers and putting on weight for the winter up at timberline. There's all kinds of broadleaf plants. The main things that elk eat are forbs and grasses. Grass is pretty self-explanatory. Forbs are herbaceous, non-wooded broadleaf plants. So think flowers, also think like big mountain shrub type plants. What we call the rut is the male's cyclical response to the cows going into heat or menstruation. The impetus for the cows going into heat or menstruation is the amount of light that enters the photoreceptors of their eyes and therefore their brain. In order for the calves that are birthed in the spring to survive, they are on a very tight schedule between the spring green up and the fall freeze to fatten up. There will be early and late births, but most elk in Colorado will breed during this period. Where do elk bed? Where do elk bed? Elk bed in north-facing slopes. They bed on north-facing slopes on spurs, and on that spur that is north-facing, they will tend to bed on the east face of that spur. That's because the morning light is the least intense of the sun throughout the day, and if they have to choose when to be hit by sunlight, they're going to choose the lightest or least intense sun for their beds. Elk are as calorically efficient as possible out of necessity or they will die, and so they move as little as possible and regulate their temperatures to not stay too hot. They do that by selectively choosing their bedding areas. Elk survive, albeit with a thicker coat, in winters here where it's -10 degrees or colder, so an 80-degree day here is very hot for an elk. Elk prefer north-facing slopes for beds with somewhat close access to water and ideally food. During September, the bulls are not super interested in food. They're more interested in the cows, and the cows are very interested in food still. If possible, Colorado elk will live during the rut in smaller areas if it affords them more safety and less human interaction. Elk are much less tolerant of being bumped than deer and will bed in much more select places. They will walk some distance to get to a safe bed if needed. Deer will bed nearby or on the go. Look for benches. A bench can be the size of a human bench, or it can be the size of a football field or two. The main idea here is a bench is a flat area on a slope that is otherwise pretty steep. If you're a big animal like an elk, 500, 600, 700 pounds or more, it really behooves you to bed on a flat area, often with some kind of soft bedding material under you, and as we already discussed, in a cool area as well. To recap, the main areas to look for beds for elk are north-facing slopes with north-facing spurs and draws. Off of one of those north-facing spurs, on the eastern-facing slope, that is where an elk will prefer to bed. Ideally with water, food, and a bench on one of those north-facing, eastern-tending spurs, that's a prime spot to look for elk. On the north-facing slopes, for food opportunities, look for canopy disruptions. Canopy disruptions can be things like avalanche chutes, fires, beetle kill, or aspens. That is why you often see so many dead elk pictures in aspens. The aspens let a lot more light through than the dark timber, and the food on the forest floor around the aspens is much more available and appealing than the very small amount of food that is in the dark timber. The dark timber or the forest is pretty much a food desert where elk will go to bed or to traverse through. You may see elk in deep timber walking or south faces that are in intense sunlight, but generally they're just on their way to a destination. They're just passing through these areas. If you can narrow down what parts of the mountain are going to hold elk for food or water or bedding or breeding opportunities, you can eliminate the areas that elk will just be passing through. A trout may pass through riffles or strong currents, but they generally hang out in areas with high food opportunities and low caloric output. Most animals, including elk, are the exact same. Find areas that will hold elk. The distance from roads or trails doesn't really matter in Colorado. They can be measured in miles or yards. Elk are more tolerant of hearing humans than seeing or particularly smelling them. I've been finding elk in over-the-counter and easy-to-draw units consistently under a mile from roads. I usually find the elk about 500 to 800 yards from the roads, and more often I can hear the cars passing while I'm interacting with the elk. Elk daily pattern. Elk will generally go down to feed in the evenings as the sun sets and the thermals change. Sometimes due to terrain or other circumstances, elk will go up to feed on a plateau or mesa above them. Or they will sometimes crest the ridge above their bedding areas before heading down on the opposite side of the mountain, or they will eat at ridgeline. They will feed all night and often rest or bed in the food source under the safety of darkness. As the sun rises or just before, elk will go to their beds, which are generally 3/4 of the way up whatever slope they are occupying. Elk in Colorado will rut around 8,500 feet, sometimes a bit higher by around 1,000 feet or lower by a couple thousand feet. They will then rest all day in their beds, possibly getting up midday to get water or a small bite of food. Find out what the elk in your area eat. Elk can have a pretty varied diet, but mainly focused on grasses and forbs, as we just talked about. Find out what the main diet of the elk in your area is and learn to ID those plants. All elk need water, bedding, and sex opportunities, but their particular food could be the tipping point in focusing on one drainage versus another one. If there's 10 drainages in a row that look really interesting, and you can narrow down the elk in your food have a strong preference for some type of plant, you can go in that area. What are thermals? Thermals are the daily patterns of the air heating and cooling en masse, and therefore having an effect on wind currents in the hills. The basic pattern is, as the sun comes up, the air gets warmer, rises en masse, and therefore pushes somewhat of a wind current up the hill. During the day, the air, if the sun's out, will stay heated, or the air will stay heated, and will continue to have an upward thermal draft. If it gets colder during the day, or as night sets and it gets colder, the air gets colder with it. As the sun sets, stops heating things, and the hot or the cool air, which is denser, starts to drop, and it creates a downward thermal draft, thermal wind effect. These thermals are not consistent across the entire mountain. There will be patches that heat up at differential rates. And so an area here may have a strong upward thermal, whereas 100 yards over in a deeply timbered area, the thermal may not be as strong because the wind down here is not getting heated up as much, or the air is not getting heated up as much. The thermals do not dictate the daily wind patterns of the mountains. They interact with them and are factors of the wind patterns. So if we have some kind of a front blowing in, like we do today off the Indian Peaks, that wind is pushing this way, pushing off of the storm, but we also have a bit of an upward wind pattern, because it's pretty darn hot out today. And so if we pull out our wind checker and we check the wind, you can see it's pretty well coming off of this storm and up. And actually, the front of the storm is so strong that it's pushing it more like this than the heat of the thermal is pushing it up. So that's a perfect example of how the two might interact. This is a wind checker. It lets you check the direction of the wind visually. So where are all the elk? Simply put, they are where you're not. Like Randy Newberg says, due to distance, but more and more I found due to topography. These places I have described are simple to understand and find, but usually not easy to access, for one reason or another, topographically speaking. Get creative, think outside the box, and get off the beaten paths. Colorado has a humongous and expansive trail system, and this idea that there is a wilderness area, that there is a plethora of elkin that no one has tapped before, simply doesn't exist anymore. There's not a lot of deep wilderness areas in Colorado without trail systems, and so elk have become very adept at living in smaller areas and very specific areas. Learn some of this animal behavior I've described to you. Learn what the particular elk in the area you're hunting like to eat, and combine it with e-scouting resources, and I guarantee you'll have more encounters this year, and some of those encounters will turn into opportunities and hopefully elk in the freezer. I exclusively hunt elk in September with the bow. I've been doing it for 13 years now, so let me know if there are any other questions you'd like about bow hunting elk in Colorado in September. Thanks for checking out the video, guys. Good luck this September.
So I just wanted to clarify some of the terms that I used a little bit earlier in the video about north-facing slopes, draws, spurs, and where elk might prefer to bed in the whole picture here. So this main part of the picture that we're looking at right here, this is all a north-facing slope. This is oriented the top of the map north. The right of the map is east, northeast, down south, left is west. So this whole area is north-facing slope, with the equator being to the south. And so with the sun centered over that, this north-facing slope is going to receive much less light than a south-facing slope, just for starters. And then we'll get into, these are what we call spurs. And these are high points coming off of the top of the mountain going down. And these are what we would call draws that are created between these spur high points. These geographical features can be measured in hundreds or thousands of yards. Now within this north-facing area, I discussed that they'll be on east-facing spurs that are north-facing. So let's take this one, for example. This is a very nice, obvious north-facing spur. And on the east side of it, you can see there's this little tucked-in area right here. And it just so happens that with these good distances between the contour or topographic lines, we know that there's going to be some kind of a break or ease in elevation here. And so this would be a really great area to look for a bench on a north-facing slope, on a north-facing spur with an easterly direction here. I'll also bet that in one of these little draws, there's going to be some kind of water source, often some kind of mountain spring or stream that doesn't even make it down to the main river down here. And so the elk will be able to maintain a great existence, feeding, bedding safely, and getting water in a fairly small area here without having to expose themselves to what you can see as human activity pretty much all around them. This area in particular would be a great area to check out for elk. It's a little high in elevation, but it's still interesting. With that road at the top of the map you see there, 306, a lot of folks will be deterred from crossing that or crossing, say, the river just south of that road because there may not be official crossings. So again, with the idea of getting off the beaten path and going where others might not, wading across that river in your skivvies might be a good option for you to get where some other folks might not be willing to check out. But this whole slope is pretty interesting. And again, elk will deal with hearing people. They'll even deal with seeing people, but they don't like smelling or having any kind of an interaction with people. They're okay with seeing them from quite a distance or kind of being aware that a human is there, but if a human's activity affects their activity at all, it really bums them out and makes them want to leave. So I hope that was helpful as far as defining the north-facing slopes, the spurs, the draws, and what a bench on one of those spurs could look like.